Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, David. And yeah, I think introducing it in respect of how operational history and social history kind of meet is a very good way of looking at it, because that is exactly what this story is about. And what I hope to inform you of by the end of this afternoon's presentation really is just to enlighten you a little bit more on the role the Postal Service had in the First World War. Some of you may know a little bit, some of it may be fairly obvious if you think for a few minutes about it. But what I hope you'll see by the end of this presentation is that actually the role the Post Office had was far, far greater and far more important and far more widespread than most people will recognise or appreciate at the offset. It's also a story that hasn't very often been told. It's covered briefly in general histories of the First World War, talk about the postal side of things and some of the aspects that we'll talk about today. If you look at histories of the Postal Service and books on postal history, it touches on it and touches on the fact that the Post Office had a role to play in the First World War. But it's not a story that's ever really been told in any great depth. And the first time that this was really done was 2008, when we put together an exhibition at the Postal Museum, working in partnership with Imperial War Museums at what was called then Churchill Museum and Cabinet War Rooms. And we did this sort of exhibition that told the story of the Postal Service in the First World War, and that's really what this presentation is based on that exhibition. It's actually structured around that exhibition. It was the first time we really dug down into some of the records that we hold at the Postal Museum. The Postal Museum holds the official archive of the Royal Mail and the Post Office. So we look after their business archive, and within that business archive is where most of the photographs, the vast majority of the photographs that you're going to see this afternoon come from, and also the information, the records, the stories that I will be telling you are drawn from those archives. So it's almost exclusively, with one or two very, very minor exceptions, it's exclusively drawn from the records of the Royal Mail within the Royal Mail archive, are looked after by the Postal Museum, and they're available for people to access if they so wish. So without further ado, we'll make a start. I've broken the presentation down into a number of sections, and what I want to begin by looking at is perhaps the most obvious aspect of this story, and the thing that perhaps you'll immediately think of, and that is the Post Office joining up into the war effort. And actually for the Post Office, this began at the very, very beginning of the war. The Post Office, in fact, was probably the first organisation really to have an active role in operations during the First World War. A ship by the name of the Alert, the cable ship, the Alert, there were several ships named the Alert, but when war was declared in 1914, the cable ship Alert, which had duties to maintain undersea telegraph cables, was given some sealed orders and was asked to open those orders upon declaration of war. And the captain of the ship opened the sealed envelope, and inside he was given instruction to await a naval escort, and then to go out into the English Channel and to sever the telegraph cable linking Germany and Britain. The Royal Navy weren't able to provide escort immediately. The captain of the Alert, however, took his role and responsibility very seriously and immediately put to sea, immediately went out and immediately severed the telegraph cable. So just after war was declared, so long before troops arrived in France and Belgium, long before the first kind of naval conflicts took place, a postal service ship actually severed the communication cables between the two countries as really the sort of one of the very first hostile acts. But the Post Office had a job to do beyond that at the outbreak of war, and that was, of course, to assist with recruitment. The Post Office was responsible for communications, for managing communications. And so the Post Office was somewhere that people could join up. The bottom of the recruitment poster, one of the perhaps less famous recruitment posters, but one of the early recruitment posters, the bottom it says inquire at any post office, police station or labour exchange. So this is the post office acting as part of the recruitment process. So it's advertising, it's putting these posters up, but it's also somewhere people go to inquire about joining. But it wasn't, of course, just providing a recruitment office that the post office were involved with. It was providing manpower as well. Men of the post office joined pretty much every regiment, every unit in the Army and Navy that was available. But they also had their own militia battalion, the Post Office Rifles. Now, this wasn't one of the classic First World War PALS battalions. This was actually a unit that existed prior to the First World War. And this was in fact, the Post Office Rifles were the only militia battalion to see active service in South Africa, for example, as a fighting unit. The Post Office Rifles were a fighting unit. It's really important to understand two often kind of misconceptions about the Post Office Rifles. One, they were a fighting unit. They were nothing to do with postal delivery. And secondly, they were, of course, not the only units that postal workers joined. Some people sort of think, oh, Post Office Rifles, that's where all the post office workers went. It was pretty much exclusively made up of postal workers, but many, many postal workers joined other units as well. So the Post Office Rifles had a single battalion. Very quickly, a second battalion was formed because the number of men joining was so great that it exceeded the numbers that could be held in one battalion. So a second battalion was established. And by the end of the war, a third battalion was established. The third battalion remained home-based, remained in the UK as a training battalion. So many men joined the third battalion, trained at home here in Britain, and then would transfer to either the first or second battalion, serving around the world, primarily at the Western Front during the war. The Post Office Rifles had a key role to play in the war. And as I say, the most important thing to take from this is the fact that they were a fighting unit. But of course, as I say, it wasn't just that unit that men of the Post Office joined. And another key aspect of what postal workers did was to join the Army Post Office, the Army Postal Service, or the Royal Engineers Postal Section, as it was more accurately known. Again, a unit that existed before the First World War, so it wasn't something new. And what the Royal Engineers Postal Section was, it was a part of the Army, it wasn't part of the Post Office, but many of the men in the Royal Engineers Postal Section, the Army Post Office, were postal employees. And with the outbreak of war, that number increased. So more people joined the Army Postal Service, obviously bringing their skills and their experience as postal workers and dealing with post to the role of the Army Postal Service. At the beginning of the war, it was a relatively small unit, small number of people, but of course it gradually expanded. And we'll talk a little bit more about the work they did and the difference between the work they did and the work that the Post Office, the British Post Office at home, were doing in a short while. But of course, the summary of all of this really is that what the Post Office were providing, fairly obviously, was manpower. The Post Office was a huge employer of people. In fact, in 1914, it was probably the largest employer in the country, possibly one of the largest employers in the world. And when you think about it, it was a national organisation across the whole of this country. Things like railways, which are big employers, they weren't one body. There was lots of different companies. So the Post Office was, without a doubt, the largest employer in this country. So it was a ready supply of manpower. And of course, what that inevitably meant, of course, is that there was huge loss of life within the Postal Service as well. Just one example of a memorial, next of kin memorial presented to a chap called Leonard Eldridge, who served, he was a postal worker, and he served in the First World War and gave his life. Of course, many of the men who went off to fight did return, and many of the men who served in with the Post Office were commended for their bravery. One man in particular whose story we tell at the Postal Museum was that of Alfred Knight. Alfred Knight was a postal worker before the First World War. He went off to fight and he was awarded the Victoria Cross, which the Postal Museum is now very proud to hold in its collection. It's on display in our permanent galleries at the museum in London. There are actually 4 members of postal staff that we were aware of that were to receive the VC during the First World War, but Alfred Knight is the only one that we possess in the museum's collection. Alfred was also the only member of the Post Office Rifles, that battalion I talked about, to have received the VC. He got it in 1917. He survived the war. He lived for many years after the war. And there's a street in Birmingham today named in his honour. But Alfred Knight was taking part in 3rd Battle of Ypres, and his position, he was a sergeant, had been promoted to sergeant for a previous brave action, but his platoon were pinned down by enemy machine gun fire during 3rd Ypres, and he single-handedly took over the German machine gun nest. He bayoneted a number of the German machine gun operators, and he caused the rest of them to flee, and that action undoubtedly saved the life of his unit, and of course put himself in great danger, and that's what led to the award of the Victoria Cross for Alfred Knight. And as I say, we're very honoured to hold that in the museum's collection. So we've talked a little bit about the people, and I think it's very important to remember the role the people played in the Great War. But what I wanted to show you today, as I hinted at in the introduction, is that it was about more than just sending men off to fight in the war. It was a sort of a fairly obvious thing the Post Office could provide, which was a huge amount of manpower, and somewhere between 70 to about 90,000 men of the Post Office went off to fight in the Great War throughout the duration of the war. But communications at the front line was, of course, the other obvious thing that the Postal Service were about. And we can see here an example of a field post office. So these are temporary post offices. They took many forms. Sometimes they were within tents, sometimes they were in more permanent buildings. I think there's another picture in a minute that show that. Sometimes they were very, very improvised. There's a table in a sort of middle of a forest, I think, some of the looks of things. So it's a very much temporary structure that would have moved around with the movement of troops. So these field post offices were essentially like a post office at home. And these were where troops could bring their mail to send their mail. So these were run by the Army Postal Service, the Royal Engineers Postal Section, but many of these would have been influenced by or worked at by people who had that postal experience. We also had the Army base post offices, and there's an example of one of the hand stamps that would have cancelled one of the letters, and we'll see some examples of those in a short while. Newspapers were a key means of communicating and communicating along the front and getting news from home. And of course the Postal Service were responsible for the movement of newspapers, and we can see those being given out here. And we can see on this image the sorting of the mail at the front line. And I'll talk you through the process of the movement of the mail in just a moment. But what I want to sort of illustrate here is that, of course, the role of that communication at the front was vital, and it was something that the Postal Service was a part of. And I'll talk you through the process of moving the mail in just a few moments. We've got another example of one of the field post offices here, a slightly more permanent structure. This was a building that probably had a different purpose originally, but you can perhaps just about make out the FPO field post office kind of badge by the window of the office here. So this was a building where people could come and deposit their letters ready to send home. Communication at the front, of course, was not just about letter writing, and there was many different methods of communication, and we can see in the images here the lamp signalling units. So these were again part of that frontline communication, that sending messages over shorter distances. What this, I think, reminds us all of, perhaps, is that this was still early days for many forms of communication. Technology was still in its infancy, and letter writing was the main way of communicating at the outbreak of the First World War. Telegraphs had been around for a number of years, and I'll mention those in just a second. The telephone was very much in its infancy at that time. The British Post Office had only been running telephones since 1912, so only 2 years when war broke out. So this was new. So, some of the more primitive means of communication were still vital at that time. And we can see a mobile telegraph machine here. So telegraphs were really important, and it's an important moment just to reflect on what the Postal Service was doing around telegraphs. So since 1870, the Post Office had been responsible for telegraphs in this country, having taken that responsibility over from the railways. By the First World War, they were quite well established. Telegraphs were quite well established, but what the engineers, and there was about something like 35,000 postal engineers who joined up in the war effort. Again, many of them joining fighting units, but many of them joining to provide their skills and experience with the telegraph and telecommunication systems. So laying telephone cables, laying telegraph cables, and moving cables, repairing cables that would have invariably been damaged or needed moving as positions changed, as troops advanced over ground and captured ground and things. So the skills of the engineers, the postal engineers, was very, very important, and they had a key role to play in being able to help that frontline communication. Telegraphs were used obviously to communicate news back and forth to home, but they were used quite reservedly. They were used and the lines were kept clear for important communications and for military information and information from the government. They weren't encouraged for general correspondence, and of course it was expensive to use for many people, so it wasn't an option for many families to use. And telegraph messages, of course, were very short, so you couldn't relay lots of information. So letter writing still remained the main and the most important form of communication during the First World War. This is one of my favourite images from the collection that we've got, and this just really shows the very improvised nature of these cables that were being laid. And what this image actually shows is a small narrow trench, not a fighting trench, but just a trench that's been dug for one reason or another. And there's spades just jammed into the ground, supporting this cable that was stretched across the line. One method of communication that was introduced during the First World War, and was actually developed prior to the First World War, and was actually even used in South Africa, was the field service postcard. Now, the field service postcard was an important way of limiting and controlling the information that was sent back and forth, but also speeding up communication. So field service postcards were a multiple choice pre-printed card that soldiers were issued, and they were issued to military units every week. So a unit was given an allowance, a weekly allowance of field service postcards. And the government liked these because, and we'll talk about censorship later on, but they're an important part of that censorship story, and the government liked them because they limited the information that troops could say, so they couldn't accidentally reveal important military information through a field service postcard. It was also obviously quicker to write and send, and it allowed soldiers and sailors to send quick messages home. And I think I might have an enlargement of one of them here. So they are with pre-printed statements, and it states at the top quite clearly that anything additional added to these cards could result in the card being destroyed. So you simply crossed out the statements which didn't apply. So it starts with "I am well," which on this one has been left unscored through, suggesting the person was indeed well. The other option that's been scored through on this one is that I've been admitted into hospital and I'm going on well, or I'm about to be discharged soon. So it's just a way of just sending very, very quick information, not really any great detail at all. But this one has additionally had the annotation of Happy Christmas to all written in pencil at the bottom of it. So technically this has been inappropriately used and in theory shouldn't have got through, but obviously did. They obviously saw nothing too wrong with that one. Another form of communication at the front was of course the battlefield will, or the last letter home. And this is another example from the museum's collection. This is one I particularly like. This actually was written by Leonard Eldridge, as you may see on the screen. We saw his next of kin memorial a couple of slides back, so we know that Eldridge didn't survive the war. He worked for the Post Office. He didn't serve in the Post Office Rifles. He was one of these people who served in another unit, but he did work for the Post Office before the war. And he's written his last will and testament here on a scrap of paper. It's a long, thin piece of paper written in pencil, as many of these things were. It's almost like a till receipt or something. It's very long and narrow. And it's all over the place. But one of the things he talks about, this is really where our operational and social history cross over rather well. This is a nice bit of social history. What he says here is that he's writing this to his mother. It's a letter to his mother. And he tells her that his money from the post office is to be used and only used in the event of his death and only for things related to him. He says to his mother, I will never accept deception or something, I think he says. But the really interesting bit about this letter is that he leaves everything he owns to his mother with the exception of an aspidistra plant, which he leaves to a Miss Florence Smith. And he states in there, you may be able to read it, he states in there that, I'll try and remember it because I can't read it from this angle, but he said, everything I possess except the aspidistra plant of mine, I give to you. The plant with my last wish must be given to Miss Florence Smith. And he says something like, who must be treated in every respect as my lover. So there's obviously some issue between his mother and this Miss Florence Smith. Sadly, we don't know what happened to the aspidistra plant nor to Miss Florence Smith. I did try and do a little bit of research into the story. The address is given for Miss Florence Smith and the house does still exist, but I wasn't able to trace any information, sadly, on her. So having looked at some of the different forms of communication that were taking place at the front and the sorts of things that were being sent, we'll go through sort of stage by stage looking at the process of moving the mail to a world at war. And the story really begins obviously in Britain and particularly in London. And at the beginning of the war, a home depot was established. This was quite standard practice. This was something that was done during the Boer War. And a home depot was established. Originally, this was at Mount Pleasant. It expanded to another building, another post office building called King Edward Building in London, as the war began to sort of ramp up and the volumes of mail increased. But very quickly, even the building the size of Mount Pleasant became too small to deal with the volumes of mail that were being handled. And so a new temporary building was erected in the Regent's Park in London. And this building grew and grew. More bits were added on, more huts were added to the site. And actually, by the peak of the war, by the sort of 1917 period, this became the largest wooden structure in the world. It was a massive, massive building in the middle of Regent's Park. All evidence of it is gone. Very little is known about it, other than it existed. There are no plans or drawings of it. There are a few photographs of it. We've got one or two. The Imperial War Museum have got one or two. And the Royal Parks have actually got a couple of images of it as well. So these are vehicles awaiting dispatch. The home depot was central to the postal operation during the war. So really all mail destined for anywhere, any theatre of war around the world, would have come first to the home depot in London. And unlike sending a letter to in ordinary times, where you would address it to a particular place, and the most important thing on an envelope, as you're very well aware, is the address of where it's going to. The person it's going to is of no real consequence to the Postal Service. The address, the destination, is what's important. During the First World War, the opposite was true. The important thing was who it was going to, not where it was going to. It was the job of the Post Office and the Royal Engineers Postal Section to worry about where it was going to. So you would write to an individual, to a military unit, and to the GPO in London, to Regent's Park, for most of the war. And it was their job to work out where the letter then had to go to. So I've got a number of different images. So the first thing they did was they consulted what were called daily lists, which gave an indication of the port that a letter had to get to reach certain destinations. So where ships were going from, and of course ships are going every day, and sometimes they were having to leave from different ports. So every day these lists were updated to indicate what port in the UK a letter would have to be sent to get to a particular part of the world. And that would, as I say, change. But thinking about, and we've got most evidence for what happened to the Western Front, and that's perhaps the easiest element to understand, so we'll concentrate on that. And this diagram map shows sort of schematically, roughly, how it worked. So letters would have left London, they would have headed to the Channel ports in the case of the Western Front. In case of most destinations, it was from the Channel ports in the First World War. The Second World War was very different, but the First World War, it was really the Channel ports. Folkestone in particular, and Southampton, as you'll see there. And they were then sent across by ship, and I'll talk through the process with some illustrations in a moment. And then they were sent to base post offices. You saw one of the hand stamps earlier on from one of these base post offices. These were close to the Channel. They were then sent on to advanced base post offices, and then to railhead post offices. And gradually the mail was broken down to smaller and smaller quantities as it travelled towards its ultimate destination. We'll go through that in a moment. This sort of diagram here shows that breakdown. So you've got the supply railhead at the bottom of the image. That's taken up to the divisional refuelling point. And this was all part of the general supply chain of which letters and parcels were considered a part. And then broken down into these smaller and smaller units until eventually they were delivered to their ultimate destination and taken to the front line, or to the communication trenches and things where the men were based. So within the home depot, as I say, it was a very large wooden structure. A number of the images here show men working in there, and indeed men did work in there, and these were men often either postal employees or men of the Royal Engineers Postal Section. But the significant thing about the home depot was the number of women it employed. It was a huge employer of women, and as the war progressed, as more and more men went off to fight, more and more women were being brought in to work the home depot. So the home depot was a large employer of women sorters, many of them doing jobs that prior to the war would not have been considered jobs suitable for women, and the post office had to sort of change its approach to employment during the war because of the need for manpower in the effort. And what these images show, and I think, are really the quantities of mail being involved. So here you get a sense of how the mail is being sorted. The frames at the back here indicate the destination. So it's destinations by military unit, not by place, as I mentioned a moment ago. And we can see here parcels being ready into these wicker baskets, being sorted. And you can see that this is the Regent's Park home depot, because you can perhaps identify these wooden structures, wooden beams holding the building together. So this was clearly after it had moved to Regent's Park. This is at Mount Pleasant, I think, in a building that's no longer there. But again, it just shows you this really to give you a sense of the volume of mail involved. And again, this is again this is back in Regent's Park, because you can see the wood. And you can see this massive pile of bags of mail. And what's important to understand with this, and I think there's another image like it in a moment, what's important to understand with this is that this wasn't months worth of mail stacked up, having sort of sat there, not going anywhere, due to some sort of delay or something like that. This is passing through quickly. This mail is going in and out within a day or two at most, sometimes within a day. But I like this image because it just gives you a sense of the volume that's involved, the size of the job that's involved. And I think that's a really important moment to think about what I said earlier on about the numbers of men of the Postal Service that had gone off to fight. Something like 75 to 90,000 men during the war went off to fight. So the Post Office were losing their experienced postal workers, their experienced sorters, to the war effort, whether they were going off to do postal duties or whether they were going off to fight, at the same time as the workload was going up massively. So the volumes of mail they were dealing with was massively expanding. So it was a double challenge for the Postal Service at this time, not only facing the loss of all these experienced workers, but facing this massive increase in responsibilities. Gives you a little bit of a sense of the size of the home depot at Regent's Park and the extent of the building, and again, the size of the operation. So these workers were working quickly, sorting the mail to get the mail to their destinations. Again, we're overboard with these images of piles of mail, but I like them. And we've got a number of them. This one was destined for Australian troops. So again, you can see the quantities of bags. These are parcels in here, you can tell. But you can see the quantity of mail that's being sent, and all passing through the depot in a fairly short period of time. Another one there. This was volumes of mail that the Post Office hadn't experienced before. This wasn't the sort of thing they were used to, and in previous wars, the volumes of mail weren't anything like this. So from the depot, the home depot, it was loaded at the loading bays, loaded onto vehicles, both motorised and horse-drawn vehicles, and from there taken to the Channel ports, as I mentioned, and they're loaded onto ships. So this is mail below the deck on a ship. This is almost certainly Folkestone, I would think. So this is mail being lowered into the ship, taken across the Channel, in this case to Calais, where it was of course unloaded, taken off the ships, transferred to rail, where it was then taken onto, as per that diagram I showed you a moment ago, taken onto those railhead post offices. And we can see again the quantities of mail being ready to be loaded onto the train carriage here. And this train ready to take the mail onwards. So it's a number of steps, a number of processes, a number of forms of transport used in order to get the mail on its onward journey. And then of course when it reached the final destination, it would have been carried by a postal orderly, delivered by a postal orderly in small quantities, like a bag full of mail might be delivered to particular areas. So it was a huge logistic exercise, and very, very complicated. Working out, not because you weren't sending mail to destinations, you were sending it to people, and the Postal Service was having to determine where that mail was going. But even looking at those quantities of mail over a very short period of time, it's important to remember that it was a quick service, and to the Western Front, it was different to theatres of war further afield and to sea and places like Mesopotamia and things like that. It took a lot longer. But to the Western Front, on average, mail was taking 2 days to arrive. And actually, one of the biggest complaints that soldiers had during the war about the Postal Service wasn't the speed of letters coming, because 2 days is very, very quick, even by today's standards. the biggest complaint they had was the order in which letters arrived in. Sometimes it was so quick and so efficient that letters posted later were arriving before ones posted earlier. So people were receiving letters with the second half of a story, and then a day later getting the first half of the story, and letters had arrived in the wrong order. So the biggest complaint a lot of the soldiers had, as I say, was not to do with the fact that it was taking a long time. It was the fact that because they were coming so quickly, they were actually, catching up with one another, and sometimes, letters overtaking each other in the system, because for some reason it had obviously got there a bit more quickly, and maybe there had been a delay with the first delivery. So that we've seen a little bit of evidence of that coming up in the sources. Focused mainly on the Western Front today, and that's obviously borne out really because that's what most of our records talk about, but just wanted to reflect on the fact that, of course, other theatres of war were involved, and letters were going all over the world. This wasn't just something that was serving the Western Front. Here we can see something for Murdos, Mediterranean port, and we've got Salonika here as well. So this was a letter destined for a field post office, or sent from a field post office in Salonika. And of course also transport being adapted for other purposes. So here we have a sleigh or sledge used for mails going to Archangel, northern Russia. So it really was a global operation. So having looked at the operational side of things, how the postal system and service was working, I just want to look a little bit at the changes that then came about because of this. So the post office was forced to change because of what was happening. Obviously, I said already, the loss of all its employers, so many of its experienced employees, and the volumes of mail involved. So just to look briefly at the volumes of mail involved. At the peak of the war in about 1917, you can see the graph shows October 1914, the letter traffic, by comparison, relatively low, about 1 million, significantly under that with parcels traffic. At the peak of the war, it's about 1917, we're looking at, this is per week, 12 million letters a week being sent. 12 million a week, most of them getting there within sort of two or 3 days to the Western Front, and parcel traffic at about 1 million a week. So it's phenomenal figures. And this is all at a time, as I say, when a lot of the operation of the Postal Service was having to change. Mentioned it briefly already, the employment of women, both working at the home depot. We talked about in a number of examples of temporary workers at the home depot, but also on delivery duties. And we can see here postal woman in uniform that she was issued with, and many more women were beginning to be employed, something in the region of 30 to 35,000 women employed by the Postal Service during the First World War. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, the range of duties and responsibilities that they had changed. At the beginning of the war, it was fairly limited. As the war progressed, they were given more and more responsibilities, more and more duties to perform as part of their role. It wasn't just delivery of letters. Here we have the home depot again, and we have women mending parcels. So these are parcels that have been damaged in transit, so they're mending them before sending them on their way. And this is another image of the broken parcel section, so women working in the depot. But women weren't just doing these sorts of jobs, they were doing sorting of mail, they were doing delivery of mail, as per the previous image suggested, and they were beginning to undertake duties such as, one of the duties that was held off from giving to women for a very long time during the war was the returned letters work. Now, returned letters obviously are letters that haven't reached their destination. Still happens. We still is a returned letters duty in the Postal Service today, where the address is completely wrong or indecipherable. But of course, during the First World War, what returned letters often were letters that couldn't be delivered because the intended recipient had died or was at least missing in action or captured. And one of the jobs that the they had to do was to take these letters and open them, read them, and try and determine from where they came in order to send them back. And often it could well be the first that families heard of the fact that their loved one was missing in action was when they got the letter back as undeliverable. We have a series of letters and postcards in the collection at the museum. I don't think I've got an image of one of them here, but that chart this story of Harry Brown, his name was, a soldier who went off to fight in 1915. He set sail to fight in the war, and his mother he and his mother corresponded regularly, and his mother got one of his letters back saying it was undeliverable because he was missing. She wrote to the Red Cross, and correspondence went back and forth. It turned out that Harry had in fact been taken prisoner. He'd been injured and taken prisoner during a particular battle, and as the letters then show that he's traced to a German prisoner of war camp. We get some postcards back from Harry to his mother, telling his mother that he's okay, that he's been injured, but that he's being looked after and he's on the mend. So that story started really by Harry's mother receiving this returned letter. And one of the duties that originally was held back from women was managing that returned letters office. But by the end of the war, women were doing that duty as well. The situation became such that they needed more and more people. Just to finish Harry's story, just to bring it to a conclusion, Harry was, as I say, injured, held in a prison of war camp, moved to several different prisoners of war camps during the progress of the war, and managed to correspond with his mother back and forth. He then took ill, sadly, while in a prison of war camp, had some sort of blood disorder. Not exactly clear what exactly it was, but some sort of blood disorder that he contracted while in the prison of war camp. And initially looked as though he was getting better, but sadly Harry died on, I think it was the 27th of November 1918. So he survived the period of fighting and sadly, as so many did, sadly died after the armistice had been signed. And we get that complete sort of catalogue of his story through the letters that we have in the Royal Mail Archive. Another duty that female employees were doing was beginning to take on driving duties. Again, this was something originally women weren't permitted to do. And we have this rather wonderful image here of horse-drawn van drivers, all women horse-drawn van drivers, so they're taking on this extra duty. There was also, some of you may be aware of the role of a boy messenger, messengers who were literally boys, children who were delivering telegrams to people. Girls were doing this as well, again, girls, not women, children. They were delivering telegrams, and girl probationers, as they were known, were expected to deliver telegrams. So the range of duties that were being undertaken was increasing. But another thing that was happening, of course, was the need to reduce some facilities. So reduction in hours that post offices were open, reduction in telegraph services and things like that in order to sort of save effort for the war effort. So to move on to link into what was going on at home, so touch on it a little bit, the post office's home front. And this again is where I hope we'll see and hope to show you some of the variety and the fact that it wasn't just about sending men off to fight and delivering letters. The role of the post office was much, much broader than that. And one of the things that we're doing was, even despite these huge volumes of mail that were being encountered, this 12 million letters a week, 1 million parcels a week, the post office were helping encourage more, or encouraging people to send more. So there's an appeal here to send books and reading matter to the troops. and you simply, no postage needed to be paid. You simply took it to the post office, handed it in, and this would be sent to those fighting. So not only dealing with these massive volumes, but encouraging more people to send more things and making the job harder for themselves at the same time. They're also involved with promotion of the war bonds scheme and the management of the war bond scheme. So this was obviously a way of helping to pay for the war. And during the First World War, we see the first use of what we now call slogan marks, advertising on cancellations. You see it all the time now with slogans that cancel stamps, relaying messages, sometimes sponsored by a company promoting a product, sometimes conveying kind of national messages or commemorating national events. But during the First World War, we see the first occurrence of this, where they're advertising the war bonds scheme, and they're advertising people to buy war bonds to help in the war effort, help fund the war. And we can see another example of the war bonds. So this is the first example of the first slogan cancellation. So any kind of postal historians out in the audience there who may well be familiar with these. We can see some information here from the Times newspaper on the National War Bond Scheme. So the Post Office were involved in the administration of that. You have to remember the Post Office was a government department, so one of the things they were doing was the bidding of the government, basically. So they were acting, as they still do to an extent, as a kind of front of house service for the government. So people were going into post offices to buy these war bonds. This article from the Times from after or the end of the war, 1918, shows £1.4 billion worth of bonds sold. So it just gives you an indication, again, of the scale of the job, really. I mean, £1.4 billion is a lot of money today. It was a phenomenal amount of money in 1918. And really, just show that, just to again give you a sense that the Post Office were being expected to deal with this and help manage this process at the time, as I've said a number of times now, where they were losing their experienced staff, where they were dealing with these huge volumes of post. So it was massive extra responsibility and extra duties, and not something that perhaps you immediately think of as something they had to do. They also manage separation allowances. So again, like today with the Post Office, where you go to draw pensions and apply for licenses for things, separation allowances were administered by the Post Office. So these were allowances that were given to families at home who were in financial difficulties because their main breadwinner was off fighting in the war effort. So again, it was just yet another duty the Post Office were expected to deal with. The Post Office also ran a relief fund. This was a sort of charitable enterprise, essentially, that Post Office employees could pay into, that then offered help and assistance, financial assistance to staff and to families of staff. So if somebody had been killed or badly injured in the war, and needed financial, couldn't work anymore as a consequence, etc. So it was a charitable enterprise, as I say, and had an income of £90,000 a year in 1916. Again, which is a phenomenal amount of money. And this was Post Office workers, those who weren't off fighting, donating money from their pay, from their salary to this charity, which then helped those postal employees, those families of some of their colleagues who were in need. And the Post Office Relief Fund ran again in the Second World War, so it was something they repeated. There was an additional scheme set up. It was, very successful, very well received. But again, what I think it sort of shows is the sort of, this is, our sort of social history side of things. This is what the Post Office were doing for its employees, and what I think the Post Office were very good at that time was supporting its workers and the families of its workers. So it was a very kind of an organisation that did really think about compassionately for its workers. At the end of the Second World War, a further kind of charitable enterprise was established called the Post Office Fellowship of Remembrance, and that actually set up convalescent homes and hotels that allow postal workers and their families to go and stay at reduced rate, and that organisation in a small way still exists to this day. But that was set up for those who, families of those who'd lost people or who'd been affected by both the First and the Second World War. But it was set up after the Second World War. But again, it's another example of what the Post Office was doing and the postal staff were doing for families of those affected by the war. The final section I just want to reflect on a little bit, and I've touched on it a bit, is around the story of censorship. Censorship was obviously a very important part, and there were two aspects to censorship. One was about controlling military information, not allowing military information to reveal details of people's location or military plans that might get into enemy hands. But also it was about morale. It was about controlling the message. The government were very conscious that what people heard about the war was the version of the war that they wanted to be relayed. They didn't want to demoralise both people at home by revealing the true horrors of what was going on, in particular at the Western Front, and didn't want to relay necessarily kind of bad news to the men at the front about how their families were suffering as a consequence of them being away, so as not to demoralise the men. So the government were very conscious of what information was being relayed. This is a really important document. It's not very much to look at all. It's a very plain piece of paper, typed, written. But this is actually the Post Office's warrant to act as censor on postal matters. So it's a warrant issued to the Postmaster General, who was essentially the government head of the Post Office. And eagle-eyed amongst you will spot the date at the bottom, 5th of August 1914. I don't think any need to comment on the significance of that date, but what this shows is that at the very beginning of the war, the Post Office were immediately being asked to act as censor. So this is the warrant to act as postal censor, to intercept mail, read it, and if necessary, withdraw it from, or redact it at least from, being sent on. So it's a very important sort of part of the story. So mail was censored. Now, mail was censored in two ways, and there's sometimes a lack of sort of understanding about exactly how this worked. But for ordinary soldiers, rank and file, their letters would have been censored by their officers, so their immediate superior, at the point of writing, more or less. So officers would have to read the letters of their men and check that the information they'd put in them was, safe information, that they weren't relaying anything. They had what's called a blue pencil, was literally a blue pencil, although it was many times done in different ways. And things could be scratched out, or it could indeed be completely destroyed if the whole letter contained information that wasn't acceptable. But letters were also censored more centrally as well. So there was base censors, and there were censors at the post office that could intercept letters and read them. So letters were censored at various points along their journey. The first point of censorship was at that local level. And we can see a number of different examples. This one is quite interesting because it shows naval censorship, passed by the naval censor here. But why this is also interesting for those who, philatelists or postal historians amongst us, you can see what's called a blind cancellation. So the stamp's been cancelled, but there's no information on that cancellation marking there as to where it's come from. And that's because it's been sent from a ship. So they didn't want, if this letter was to get into enemy hands, they didn't want, obviously, the location of where it had come from to be known. So it's cancelled the stamp, obliterated the stamp to stop it being reused, but without revealing information, as you would get on a postmark today, for example, that would tell you where it had come from. Another example of a passed by censor mark, and there were numbers for all these censors so they could be traced. And this one shows a number of different markings. The censor marking here, the field post office marking here, and this one has got an instructional marking saying that it's been delayed because it's been improperly posted, so something wasn't right. It was delayed on its journey, so it's got an instructional marking on it as well. Now, sometimes, of course, if you were a soldier writing to your family on personal matters, you might not want your immediate superior, your immediate commanding, or not even your commanding officer, but your platoon commander or whatever, reading your letters. So they introduced what were called honour envelopes, or green envelopes as they were usually known. And you were asked to sign a declaration on the front of the envelope. It would have been here, as the instructions say here. Sign this declaration to say that the letter contains only personal private matters, and therefore doesn't need to, nothing in it that shouldn't be, sort of thing. That didn't mean it didn't get censored. It just meant it didn't get censored by your immediate superior, by your officer. It would go in this sealed envelope and it would go into the postal system, but it would get censored potentially later on. This example actually is interesting because this one, for one reason or another, the correspondent didn't sign the declaration, whether they just forgot, whether they deliberately didn't sign it or what. It was probably just an oversight. And so this one was opened by the censor and read. It was subsequently passed by the censor, so what they'd written in it obviously was okay. But there's an instructional mark here saying that because it wasn't signed, the letter had been opened, and we can see it's been resealed by the base censor. So it's been examined by the base censor and resealed. Sometimes, though, letters did get through with information that perhaps ought not to have been seen. And this example, a letter from a chap called William Cox, who's writing. It's not completely clear where he's writing from. There's a number of different possibilities with this, but he says in his letter, at the end of his letter, he says, "P.S. We suffered no damage during the bombardment. And there was no reply to the German guns, as we have no guns to reply with. I only wish we had some." So that really shows, I think, quite well and quite fittingly what the purpose of the censor was. This letter obviously got through, many examples did, but it shows, I think, the purpose of the censor controlling that information. That is where I wanted to sort of conclude and leave the presentation for this afternoon. But what I hope this presentation has shown you is that the role of the Postal Service during the First World War was wide-ranging, was important, and that it was a complex operation, and that the role and the duties of the Post Office were far wider than simply what you might come to expect. Thank you very much for your time.